Today's lecture is co-organized with the Institute of Real Estate Studies. Today, we are honored to have with us Mr. John Macomber, Senior Lecturer of Business Administration at the Harvard Business School. Mr. Macomber focuses on the future potential for the private design, finance, and delivery of public infrastructure in urban areas. His classes and writings at Harvard look at organizing large pools of capital to help address problems and opportunities in urbanization. We have invited two distinguished panelists for our moderated panel discussion. Professor Deng Yongheng, Provost Chair, Professor, Real Estate and Finance, Head of Department of Real Estate at the School of Design and Environment at the National University of Singapore. Professor Tong was formerly the director of the Institute of Real Estate Studies at NUS from 2009 to 2017. He previously chaired the World Economic Forum Global Agenda Council on Real Estate and co-chaired the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network Singapore chapter, among others. His research interest spans over different areas of real estate finance and urban economics worldwide, particularly on the China market. We also have with us Mr. Goh To Sim on the panel, who is the Executive Director and President of Investment and Asset Management at EC World Asset Management Private Limited. Mr. Goh has over 20 years of experience in the management of industrial parks, real estate development, and business management in China. He had served in Keppel Corporation, Ascendus China Private Limited, and the China-Singapore Suzhou Industrial Park. He was awarded the Friend of Jiangsu, Suzhou, and Changzhou Honorary Citizenship and the Jiangsu Labor Award. The format for today's lecture will start off with a presentation by Mr. Macomber, followed by panel discussion, then a Q&A session with the audience. The session will be moderated by Mr. Ho Tong Yen, General Manager, Group Corporate Communications at Keppel Corporation. Mr. Ho was previously CEO of the Sino-Singapore Tianjin Eco-City Investment and Development Co. Limited from January 2011 to June 2015. I will now invite Mr. Macomber to share with us his insights on the topic of financing sustainable cities. Mr. Macomber, please.
So, as Shuhei said, I study how to build new cities all around the world. So it's kind of nervous-making to be here in Singapore, because Singapore is best in class at building a new city and a new country from almost nothing in 1965. As I understand, it was mostly tigers and caterpillars and nothing else. So it's exciting and it's intimidating to be with you, but we're all trying to think how to do city building over and over again. So my job tonight is to share some of my research, some global examples, give you some what-ifs looking forward, and to try and set up a thought-provoking and interesting panel discussion, because the panelists have really done some of these things in Tianjin and Suzhou and other places, and I think we'll learn a lot from drawing that out. So my thought about the flow of the evening is talk a little bit about what I see, talk a little bit about some ideas and examples here and elsewhere, get the reaction from these experts, and then hear from all of you. So the plan is we'll all learn. So to start with, what I see or what I look at is I focus on three trends in the world that will certainly affect your careers and my kids' careers and possibly mine. The first being massive urbanization as hundreds of millions of people move to cities all over the world seeking opportunity, whether it's in China or Brazil or United States. The second is bad and worsening resource scarcity. Not enough clean air, not enough clean water, not enough energy, not enough land, not enough food, too much garbage, too much traffic. So everybody's sort of plan A thought, or if you're in a government school, the thought is, yeah, all we need is better government that goes ahead and builds out the infrastructure we all need based on evidence, well-financed, using consensus. Does anybody follow American politics? So I'm not that optimistic about consensus arriving anywhere, maybe outside Singapore, with respect to some of these issues. So one thing we can do is all sit around and wait for better government to just arrive. Or we can think, what can the private sector do? What can business people like me and business teachers do to address these issues so we don't wind up living in a giant planet of slums? Because it doesn't look like there's going to be 10 more Lee Kuan Yews that descend everywhere else in the world anywhere soon, although it would sure be good if that happened. So how to think about addressing these questions? My research focuses on cities to look at these issues. There's lots of other ways to look at it. Why cities? First, cities, as you know, generate most of the GDP in the world. They also generate most of the greenhouse gas in the world. Second is cities tend to be the political unit that can actually act. You could certainly argue in India or in the United States that have strong mayor systems, or in China, that what a mayor does influences people's day-to-day livelihoods more than what the president does. You can argue that Bill de Blasio or Michael Bloomberg or Eric Garcetti in Los Angeles affect people's lives more than President Trump or President Obama on a sort of day-to-day basis. And the third is that cities have investments that investors understand. They understand how to invest in a bridge, a road, a power plant, a water project. So you can think of public-private partnerships in cities. It's much harder to think about that at the federal level. So that's my approach, and my approach is largely infrastructure first. Roads, bridges, water, power, on the theory that we can attract money into those, and if we have those pieces of hard infrastructure, we can get the soft infrastructure we all want, the schools, the hospitals, the jobs, and everything else. Now, this is not the only way to look at these issues, and so I have to tell my students all the time, I'm a free market capitalist and a finance guy, and I'm interested in hard infrastructure. There's other ways to look at these issues. So I offer you really a point of view more than the one true path. So with that said, what will make some of these things investable? So I look largely at the so-called infrastructure paradox. And if you've hung around with finance people, you hear about this infrastructure paradox a lot. The paradox being there are trillions and trillions of dollars in the global financial system earning almost zero, earning fixed income from bonds and from corporate securities that would like to earn more yield. And there are all these projects that are cash flowing, water, road, bridge, transit projects all over the world that should be able to get matched up with that pool of capital. How can we do that? Why isn't it automatic? What makes these projects bankable? To me, addressing some of those issues unlocks a lot of this power, both at the infrastructure level and at the city's level. So let me go through some of those trends and some examples of what I think will be happening in the future, and we'll try to apply that in the panel. So to start with about me and how I study, I came from real estate and construction. So I ran a real-world dirt and concrete cash flow business. That's kind of what I like to do. I came to academia later. I came to Harvard Business School to teach Real Estate 101, like how do you build and flip an office building. That was interesting, but it's not academically challenging. Everybody knows how to build and flip an office building. People don't know how to mobilize trillions of dollars of global capital to build new cities and roads and bridges and water from Africa to Latin America to Indonesia. So I thought maybe I can think of ways to address this. I also saw two things while I was teaching real estate at HBS. One is the more I taught in emerging markets like India in particular and Latin America, how real estate people can't expect infrastructure to exist, like power, like roads. They have to build that on their own. And the second is in thinking about, with my colleagues in the business and environment group, about the issues around carbon and growth. I'm not a scientist. I'm not qualified to talk about parts per million of carbon, but I am qualified to talk about, say, a transit project. And transit projects should be a triple win because they add to economic development, they reduce carbon because they save fuel, and they help human beings because people can get to work. Why can't we finance something like that? So I thought that's something I can contribute to. Maybe that doesn't solve the Paris Accords or bring the parts per million below 400, but it does address individual people, and it's something we can do today. So it's kind of incremental. And my cases at Harvard include the United States, but also Europe, India, Vietnam, China, Saudi Arabia, Peru, Mexico, Ethiopia, Tanzania, and Ghana. I don't have any Singapore cases. That's why I'm actually here this week. Mr. Koo asked me to come write teaching materials saying, how can we do like 30 more Suzhous? So, okay, I'll be happy to take that on and think about that prospect. That's what we're trying to do. So my conclusions so far in doing this work are several. One is about Plan A. I mentioned Plan A before for addressing all these issues. Good government, competence, use data, finance. Great, hope that happens. While we're waiting for that, there's lots of good hygiene writing around. You can look at the Center for Livable Cities, or World Economic Forum, the United Nations, the World Bank, hundreds and hundreds of pages about how to build an infrastructure project, how to build a new city, how to do all these things with transparency if you do it right. It doesn't happen. Why doesn't it happen? Well, it's the six, the reason it doesn't happen are the 6 C issues that you know about. So I'll do it alliteratively, and I'm sorry I can't do it in Chinese, just in English. or Malay. You can rank them any way you want, but the 6 C's are why these things don't happen are corruption, competence, capital, control, customers, and commitment. Or shall we say incompetence, no capital, lack of customers or real purpose, and a lack of commitment to building value in the long term. So when you see those kind of phenomena, it makes it very difficult to do something in the sensible Singapore kind of way. So first, of course, we can wring our hands and say, isn't this awful? And then we can think, how can we address it? Are there ways to address the 6 C's? Can we mitigate or defer or put off corruption, incompetence, lack of capital, poor control, no customers, and lack of commitment? So I take 3 approaches to that. They're not the only 3 approaches, but it's what I want to talk about today. One is around finance, one's around technology, and one's around demographics. Finance, technology, and demographics. So let's start with demographics. It should be simple, but it's bungled a lot. One side of demographics is huge demand. Hundreds of millions of people moving to cities, as I mentioned. They move to certain cities, cities with perceived opportunity. We should be able to channel this demand, we, the collective we, the population of the world. The other side of demographics is lack of demand. The world is awash in projects where the government or the bank or even the developer forgot, what is the purpose here? So Brasilia, the capital of Brazil, or Masdar City in Tianjin, or the 5 different King Abdul economic cities, are all things where, a few tall trophy buildings don't give you Dubai on the Red Sea or New York in Ahmedabad. How many times do developers have to be begged to be the commercial occupier? They don't want to go because there's no business. So you have to be careful, and we talked about this in our pre-meeting today, about thinking that some of the ideas of new cities are all about planning and structure when it's really about the market to begin with, around the customers and around what will make this happen. So demographics, there are huge trends moving to some cities. There are not trends going to other cities, and you have to know which ones are in the path of progress. Seems simple, people don't do it. Next, let's talk about technology. Of course, we could talk about technology for entire doctoral theses. I'm going to take 3 pieces of technology as examples relating to cities and urbanization and infrastructure. And we'll think how these could address finance, attracting people, and also thinking about some of the 6 C's. Let's just talk about sensors and data science, drones, and autonomous vehicles and ride pooling. Maybe that's 5 technologies, but I've lumped them into 3. And of course, there could be many more. So think about sensors. It seems trivial, but sensors can address a lot of issues around how to bring services to people in the emerging world. So a case study I wrote about this is in the water space in India, a company called Sarvagel, which those of you who speak Hindi know that means water for all. And in this part of rural India, in Gujarat, there was really no capability to get clean water. People would use a little bit of filtration, but the government hadn't been able to bring water. And the reverse osmosis machines were available, but they maybe cost $5,000 US, and they got stolen or they got credit up with silt or something like that. They weren't really useful. Nobody could afford them. So what Sarvagel figured out was 3 different things all having to do with sensors and technology. One is that every one of the reverse osmosis machines is fitted with a sensor that sends back to headquarters 3 times a minute, what's the temperature, what's the pressure drop across the membrane, what's the location of the unit, what's the particulate content, so they can keep track on these things. So A, if they're moved, they know it's moved, they can go find it, but also if it's being not cared for properly, if it's not being treated well, they can go out and fix it. The second thing they did was think about cashless payments. So instead of having a lot of cash leakage in the system where their franchisees were charging too much to people, they said, no, the franchisees, the customers are going to go to a shop and top up their water account the way they top up their mobile phone account. Take the mobile card to the water ATM, basically, get their water, and depart. So what did this allow them to do? It allowed Sarvagel to get more people water at a fair price. It also allowed Sarvagel to see who were the good entrepreneurs, give them extra machines, see who were the bad entrepreneurs and get rid of them. But primarily it allowed Sarvagel to have a lendable capital base, meaning they could borrow money for thousands of these machines because the lender was happy to say, yes, I understand the collateral. I can go find the machine and I understand the cash flow. So this opened up financing and entrepreneurship for thousands of people and hundreds of thousands of families to get water, basically by smart use of sensors and smart use of the data. So that's the kind of thing that I study a lot that can be replicated in many spaces. Move on and think about a second technology, which right now you think of when you're maybe trying to make Instagram pictures, which is drones. And drones are good for more than just going up and taking a picture and coming back down. For example, today in Rwanda, drones deliver blood and medicine the last half mile or the last 3 or 4 miles where there aren't any roads. So where you couldn't get people in otherwise, you had to take a bicycle or a horse, now you can take a small payload drone. And I have students who are working on drones that are fixed wing that can carry 100 kilos. If you imagine a drone that can carry 100 kilos, you have much less need to build out a huge road infrastructure with multiple lanes and multiple people all over the developing world. So this also changes the way that cities get organized if you think about things getting back and forth. It's not just in Rwanda. Amazon is working with these kinds of delivery systems in the United States, and it wouldn't surprise me if Singapore had things quietly being delivered by drone now that I hadn't heard about yet. On the third side, let's talk about autonomous vehicles and ride pooling. Now, people think about autonomous vehicles and they think about some rich guy in San Francisco in his Tesla with his feet up going from San Francisco to Stanford. To me, that's not where autonomous vehicles are going to have impact. Because autonomous vehicles, in addition to being nice for the rich guy in the Tesla, also go through intersections much faster than regular cars. They go through 5 or 6 times faster because they don't need to have regular human beings worried about the stoplights and everything else. That means you can get 5 or 6 times the throughput through exactly the same tarmac. I think this will be a traffic solution for jammed up cities like Jakarta that you all know, or Mumbai, or Sao Paolo. If you couple that with ride pooling, with the idea that people can find out that drivers of those small 10-person vans can find people by phone, aggregate them, and take them all from the same origin to the same destination, you get people off the roads, flagging down those illegal vans in every emerging city. They're going every which way and endangering people and jamming up traffic. So between the ride pooling concept and the AV concept, there's a chance to move 10 or 20 times as many people over the same roads at less cost and without having to build metros all over everywhere, which only 2 cities in the world can figure out, Hong Kong and Singapore, maybe Tokyo. Other than that, it's really hard to imagine metros. So will these be in San Francisco and Singapore tomorrow? I don't think so, actually. There's such car cities and such resistance to autonomous vehicles, those first world countries won't have them. Will they be in the emerging market? Yeah, I think so. Where else will they be? They'll be in American second-tier cities who are trying to compete. So, for example, I did a talk in Rochester, New York. There used to be, it's in upstate New York, it's about 300 miles from New York City. There used to be 500,000 people in Rochester, it's headquarters of Kodak and Bausch & Lomb. Now there's half that many, there's 250,000 because Kodak and Bausch & Lomb both disintegrated. Rochester has all these empty roads. They're driving buses all over the place at a public subsidy in order to get low-income people from where they live in the suburbs to work. In Rochester, they're aggressively thinking, we can do ride pooling and autonomous vehicles, make it better for these people to get to work, get all these buses off the road, and Rochester is going to compete and defeat other upstate New York little dinky cities like Syracuse, Schenectady, Troy, Albany. You don't know most of these cities, but if you were from New York, you would. So you see these aggressive cities moving ahead to compete in that regard. So those technologies, I think, will impact both how we can get finance and how cities will evolve between drones and AVs and pooling. Let me end up talking about finance, and I can talk about finance for a long time. My class is actually a finance course, but we can go deeper in some of these things if you want to in the Q&A. I talked earlier about the 6 C's. In finance, I'd like to talk about 3 T's, and the 3 T's are trillions, tranches, and tracking. So they aren't necessarily totally equivalent categories. The trillions refers to what I said before about trillions and trillions, tens of trillions of US dollars in the global financial system looking for yield, looking for investments. Tranches means layers. So in finance, when you tranche something, there's layers of investment that have different characteristics, that have different risk profiles, different time frames, different kind of investors, and there's a lot of opportunity there. And the third is tracking. Tracking the money so that money doesn't just go in some one giant pool and get lost, but how can you track investments specifically? So I'll give you some examples of tranches and tracking. So we talked about trillions already. In the tranches, investors are increasingly sophisticated about how to identify and split up project risk and the cash flows that go with them. This means they should be more willing to invest in projects. And I'll give you Well, first I'll say that if Fidelity or Vanguard or somebody like that can track 100 investments in your 401k or your retirement plan to the latest second, they certainly can track how micro investments are made in various financial models. And one of my favorite examples is in my hometown in Boston. There's a company called New Balance. They make shoes. And they have a factory that's on one of the train lines in Boston. They wanted to have a station built. And they thought the last thing we want to do is throw away our tax dollars into some fund somewhere in the public that gets invested someplace, who knows where. What we'd like to do is we want to build this train station ourselves because we can track where the money's going. We'll use our own vendor, and we'd like to get a credit off of our taxes for delivering this station with our own vendor. They worked this out with the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. They worked this out with the Mass Development Authority to a bond issue so that their financing goes specifically to that asset. This is a lot different and more efficient in many ways than saying, let's just throw all our money into a giant pool at the World Bank or at the infrastructure group in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. I think this will happen quite a bit more. We've also talked with big employers in my hometown in Boston, like Mass General Hospital, like Harvard, like Fidelity, who complain about how things get shut down in snowstorms or something like that. They'd be happy to contribute to specific subway cars that ran specific lines to get their people to work. They'd be happy to contribute to specific stations if they could see where their money was going, rather than put it off in the grand global pool. So I see this kind of ability to track investments on a small level as being one that will allow investors to take a little piece or a little strip of whatever happens. The second piece about tranching is around timeframes. So if you think about timeframes, there are very different aspects to a project, particularly a big infrastructure project. So take a dam, say, in an emerging market or a power plant. It's very difficult to get these things approved. It can cost tens of millions of dollars and years and years and years, and the project might go nowhere. That's why it's hard for private investors to put up with these. So you wind up having multilaterals like the Asia Development Bank, like the International Financial Corporation and people like that, but they wind up investing in these things as debt holders primarily, and the debt lasts for a long time. So you go through the inception phase to get to financial close, then you go through the construction phase, which is really risky, then you get to the operating phase, and the Asia Development Bank and the IFC still have their money tied up for 20 more years. Now it's sort of chugging along in a sort of a low-risk way. This is the kind of asset that an institutional investor should want. And when I say institutional investors, I'm talking about this pool of capital that has the trillions of dollars, which are pension funds, endowments, insurance companies, and sovereign wealth funds, not only the Singapore Sovereign Wealth Fund, but other sovereigns. But they all they don't have skill in underwriting assets. They need to have rateable bonds. So I've been talking with the international financial corporations saying, why don't you get into these investments in a way that you expect to sell the cash flow in some different time frame? Why don't you even think about taking all those good cash flows from projects that are running and securitize those in the market so people can get a rateable bond if you're a pension fund? Then you can take as the IFC that 30 or 50 or 60 billion dollars and recycle that back into the risk phase of another project. So here you wind up saying, let's take the entity most able to bear the risk, like one of the international financial organizations, but think how can we then exit this project to the people who have all the capital, which are the institutional investors. So by that layering and that tranching and that time frame, you could think how to split these things up in ways that have been understood before, but now as you can track every dollar and everywhere that it goes every step of the way, it makes it easier for those things to come through. So of course the last piece of that is around tracking. It brings us back to opening up the trillions and putting them into tranches. I talked about trillions, I talked about tranches, talk about tracking. So one example, of course, is New Balance. The second dream around tracking is coupled with cashless payments and blockchain. So you'd think that these would be able to eliminate or minimize cash leakage at the low levels, one form of corruption. Tenders for contracts should be able to be done in a transparent kind of way so that you can tell who's coming up in each area and getting which project, because some areas of corruption aren't just that you give the minister in some country an envelope full of cash, but that favorite vendors are favored over others, which means that you don't wind up having competition on the merits. So blockchain and transparency ought to be able to address that, qualify the good revenue projects, make the investors more comfortable that the cash they think is going to come through the tariff box is actually going to come to their pocket rather than leaking away. The third aspect around tracking is around commitment and investment for the long view. So one of the problems in investing in infrastructure is that it's a very big capital expenditure up front, but the benefits can be very diffuse. Think about the dam that I was mentioning. Maybe the dam has revenue from people who buy electricity, but there's lots of people who benefit from flood control, from irrigation, from driving across the top, from real estate values, because now you can build where there aren't floods. How do those benefits inure back to the investor? If you think about more sophisticated ways of tracking, there's ways to look at all those diffuse benefits, bring them back to an investor in a way that was never possible before this generation, when there's these kind of tracking and tranching capabilities to bring more capital into these projects. So how does all this stuff wrap up? So I'll tell you about some of the so-called new cities I've studied. You know some of them well. I'd be interested to think how you believe they'd stack up for would they actually attract customers. Which ones encourage competition on the merits so that you get the best vendors trying to give the best services? Which ones have a thoughtful idea for land assembly? So in the panel, we'll hear about the Sino-Singapore Suzhou Industrial Park, which is sort of the poster child for all these kind of efforts in the world. Although 20 years ago, the world looked a lot different in terms of China's capabilities and what Singapore could bring. We'll hear about Tianjin, but you can also think about King Abdullah Economic City in Saudi Arabia, or Fumihung in Vietnam, or Hawassa, which is an industrial park in Ethiopia, or Eco-Atlantic in Nigeria, Mahindra World Cities, which aren't cities, they're industrial parks, and so on. And I can talk about, are there general things that move forward in each of these? And some other old tier examples, which I'll sort of move beyond. But in conclusion, before the panel starts, my question is whether demographics, technology, and finance, the three things I started with, can be deployed so we have reason to believe that these trends can be addressed and solved. The urbanization trend, the resource scarcity trend, the government are stuck. So we need to address those three things. I believe that cities are the place to focus because investors get it, and infrastructure does that as well. And we all need to do more than just wring our hands up and fret about competence, corruption, lack of capital, lack of commitment. We can actually go out and invest in a way that makes these things happen. And there are three pieces to the approach around demographics, technology, and finance. And within the finance, the trillions, the tranches, and the tracking. So the cities who want to win will do this, whether it's Rochester, New York, or Suzhou, or Singapore. The cities who don't are going to lag behind, and they're going to become the global cities that are also rans. Now, of course, you all are young and have a chance to go where you want to go, but if I'm advising some of those cities that are going to be also rans, I say, don't be also rans, follow these other examples we're talking about. So as you can tell, I can talk extemporaneously for a very long time. My class is 28 sessions long. I was not asked to talk for 45 hours. So let me wrap up my remarks here. Let me bring the panelists up, and they can blow to bits everything that I just told you about all these other aspects. Thank you very much.